All right, there we go. Thank you, Peter Dutton. Great to see you here this morning, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. We have something coming now that if you haven't seen or heard before, you need to see and hear this, and if you have seen or heard it before, you need to see and hear it again. The sponsor of our guest speaker today is Symbion, and I'm going to introduce Jason Blanchard. He's their Head of Operations and BD from Ventura Health to say a few words on behalf of the sponsor. Thank you so much. Give him a round of applause. Here he is.
Thank you, Michael. Wow, welcome to day 2 of APP 2024. Congratulations, Trent, for your team, for everything you do for the industry, as well as your members. Andrew Crawley often says, the shorter the speech, the louder the applause, so I'll keep this brief. And as many know, it's hard for me to keep things brief. I am the Operations Manager for Ventura Health. Ventura Health was launched in 2014 together with Symbion and supports multiple pharmacy brands, including Cincotta Chemist, which has been a leading pillar of the community for over 70 years. Remiss of me not to say that the company founder and industry stalwart, Albert Cincotta, sadly passed away last year. Albert opened his first store in Western Sydney in 1952 and was a trailblazer for retail pharmacy, affordable prescriptions, extended trading hours, and his commitment to his customers will live on, especially with the Cincotta's brand motto to be famous for care and famous for value. It's always a highlight to come to APP. It's a valuable opportunity to reconnect with colleagues, friends, industry partners, customers and other pharmacists to share ideas, solutions and even some frustrations. Before we get to today's keynote speaker, I'd like to briefly provide an overview of the Symbion business and the capabilities available for customers. Firstly, we extend a big thank you to existing customers for your valued business and support. It's never taken for granted, and each of you are at front of our mind when we are making decisions. With nearly 4,000 retail pharmacy customers, some 1,300 hospital customers, supply of product and services of our customers is paramount important to us. Our 10 distribution facilities coordinate daily deliveries and house more than 17,000 products from over 550 manufacturing partners, placing us at the forefront of pharmacy support. We continue to invest significantly in our operational infrastructure, including new contract logistics and medical consumable distribution centres in Sydney and Melbourne. If you're at last year's APP, you would have seen we launched the new Symbion Elite Reward program for customers who use Symbion as their primary wholesaler. Since the launch, we've received over 500 registrations and awarded over 900 million Symbion reward points. Visit the Symbion stand if you'd like to learn more about that, and also enter into a draw for 2 international business class flights thanks to Qantas. I am pretty flexible with dates too, by the way, if you win. At our stand, you can also discuss our improved customer portal shop, which has been redesigned based on our customer feedback. While you're at the stand, please also talk to us about our offer to independent pharmacies and also our continued support to those pharmacists that do want to join a brand like Cincotta or Terry White. Given the growing corporatisation to our sector, we continue to support pharmacies being owned by pharmacists, and the independent sector remains vital to our success. At Symbion, our purpose is to work with our partners to connect communities to care, whatever the obstacle. Today's guest speaker, South Australian anaesthetist and cave diver Dr. Richard Harry Harris, knows all about overcoming obstacles and defying odds. In 2018, Dr. Harris and dive partner Dr. Craig Shallen rose to global prominence for their crucial role in rescuing 12 junior soccer players and their coach. They were trapped for 15 days and 4 kilometres underground in a flooded cave in northern Thailand. Dr. Harris used his rare combination of skills to help develop and execute a plan to save the team as the world watched in hope. Under great pressure and putting his own life at risk, he swam through the narrow cave system to assess the health of those trapped, giving medical all clear for each evacuee and administering an anaesthetic to each of them to facilitate their rescue. The world breathed a sigh of relief. Scriptwriters furiously got to work in capturing what was a remarkable story on film, and Dr. Harris and Dr. Challenge, as said previously, were jointly awarded 2019 Australian of the Year for their rescue efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a big APP welcome to Dr. Richard Harris.
Wow, good morning. What a fantastic room. This is brilliant. And always like seeing my slides up on these amazing screens. So thank you very much for having me to speak to you this morning. We are running a little bit late, so there might not be time for questions at the end, but I'll try and crack through it without missing any of the exciting parts of the story. I think this story is very relevant to you guys because as you evolve into wider scopes of practice, clearly you're going to find some of those jobs very challenging and confronting to do. Some people will find it very easy, some people will be challenged by what lies ahead. And I think that's the essence of this story, is to do things that are difficult and well outside of your scope of practice. Maybe not this far outside of your scope of practice and maybe not quite as off-label as some of the things you're going to hear about. But it is important to challenge ourselves and evolve. And you won't hear this from many medical practitioners, but I actually think it's vital for all allied health workers to be able to expand and take over some of the traditional roles of the medical practitioner. And I'm not just saying that to suck up to you guys, but because I've worked in a lot of environments where people like nurses, paramedics, for example, are working way outside of what you would traditionally imagine their areas of practice. And I'm going to just mention a couple of those things because that experience in my life, working in these small but very, very highly functioning teams, has proved extraordinarily beneficial to a lot of the patients I've worked with. Before I do though, I feel like, when I left Thailand, having used ketamine in the way that I'm going to describe, and many of you I'm sure will know that was the kind of the key element to the success of this mission, I left something behind, and Thailand really embraced ketamine. And I found this photograph of a warehouse full of what was allegedly anhydrous ketamine. I thought, wow, when I saw this, they've really embraced it. They're going to really distribute it around the place. Unfortunately, the police and the minister over there took a bit of a special interest in it, and it was then described as the biggest ketamine bust in history, over $1 billion worth of ketamine. Unfortunately, it then evolved after a bit of a laboratory error that in fact it was, I think, trisodium phosphate, and I don't know what that is, but I think it's soap or detergent or something. So anyway, bad luck. I thought I'd left my mark on Thailand, but it was not to be. So that's my attempt at a bit of pharmaceutical humour to start the morning for you. So getting back to this area of work, and I just want to be a little bit self-indulgent to start with, to talk about how I came to be the person, I guess, who was fit for purpose for this extraordinary event, which has changed my life completely, I have to say, over in Thailand. And, I'm an anaesthetist by trade, but many of you will be aware that anaesthetists work outside the operating theatres quite a lot, and I've always been looking for a little bit of adventure, both inside work and in my personal life, and a big part of that was doing things that challenged me outside the hospital. And a pivotal moment for me and my family actually was going to work in Vanuatu for 2 years and working in a very resource-poor developing country. And I realised in those moments, and this is a picture of me anaesthetising a very sick neonate with a condition that in a place like Melbourne or Adelaide or Brisbane, I would never get anywhere near, a patient requiring such subspecialty skills. But here is a nurse anaesthetist, a locally trained nurse anaesthetist, working with me, looking after the airway while I find a vein. And then I actually did 3 patients with this particular clinical condition, of whom, even in Australia, their survival rates would be poor, and 2 out of those 3 babies survived. And it occurred to me while I was working there that, working in these small, very dedicated teams with people who have a very clear shared vision of what the goal is, in this case, the well-being of our patients, we can achieve incredible things. And even though the drugs were often literally 1 or 2 years out of date, the machines were antiquated, I remember holding a dolphin torch over an abdomen when the power went off in the hospital because they hadn't paid the bill. Stories like that actually made me realise that we are well trained in this country, our clinical skills are excellent, and we can back ourselves to do stuff like this. And you should definitely take that on board with your, the future that lies ahead for you guys. Now, I brought those skills back to Australia and started to work with the ambulance service, which had probably had a bigger budget than the whole of health in Vanuatu, but working in the retrieval system, and again, working in very small teams with paramedics and nurses, looking after patients in remote areas who had critical illness or injuries. I found it incredibly satisfying and a challenging place to work. Now, in the background, because I had to get a real job, but really secretly what I wanted to be doing was being a professional cave diver, and I've actually nearly achieved that goal now, after 30 years in medicine. Actually 40 years in medicine, that's a bit scary. I grew up in Adelaide in South Australia. From a very young age was exploring the ocean, but I was always a little bit nervous about the sharks down there, probably with good reason. And so when an opportunity came to explore the freshwater caves and sinkholes in the Mount Gambier area in South Australia, I remember visiting this very sinkhole, which was one of my first experiences. And when you see the sunlight shining down into the entrances of these places, and you realise how stunningly beautiful they are, how crystal clear the water is. They refer to it as gin clear. And in fact, the owners of this particular sinkhole now make gin out of the water. So they've really caught on to that label. And I was just obsessed by it. And that was at about the age of 22 or 3. And since then, I've basically been travelling the world, exploring caves and adventuring. And at some stage along the way, I guess probably when I got married and my wife said, "Oh, this cave diving, isn't it a bit dangerous?" And I thought, well, I guess it has some obvious hazards, but if you're well trained and you're well prepared, then like most things, like anaesthesia, like flying a plane, you can do things safely. And so I became very much more determined, especially when I had children, to manage the risks very, very carefully. And one of the things I started to think about would be if you were exploring a cave, and sometimes we dive through a cave for quite a long way, and we surface in a rock pile or a rock chamber, and sometimes we even camp there if we want to explore the cave further beyond that. But I was walking through one of these rock chambers carrying a scuba tank over my shoulder, and I suddenly thought, what would happen if I fell and broke my leg or hit my head in this environment? Someone would then have to dive me as an injured person back out through the water underground, back to the surface. And so I started to work on training and developing this capability for what we call sump rescue, which is rescuing someone through a flooded section of cave. And that was in about 2008. And since then I've been running these training programs all around Australia and in New Zealand. And this is just a photo from a couple of years ago from a cave in New Zealand. You can see the New Zealand caves are particularly muddy and actually about 6 degrees and very uninviting places. So, having this training and this capability was something that we were becoming quite good at. So when in 2018 I heard about these boys trapped in a flooded cave in Thailand, I suddenly thought, I've got to get over there. I've got a feeling that I can really be of use in this situation, and that all these years of training and acquiring these different skills in medicine and cave diving were suddenly my absolute focus for these kids. So to refresh your memories about the story, these 12 boys between 11 and 16 years of age from the Moopah, or the Wild Boars soccer team, they finished their Saturday morning practice and they decided to go off for a bit of an outing into the local cave. Now, I think when you're a young kid and you're living in a sort of rural and remote part of Thailand, surrounded by amazing jungle and mountains and this most excellent cave, that's exactly what young kids should be doing. And in my view, they didn't do anything wrong on that day. It was a perfectly sunny day. There was no sign of rain or bad weather. And in fact, there's a sign out the front of the cave that says, July till November is the cave flooding season, danger. So they were a week inside that safe time, and there was no reason to suspect that the monsoons were about to erupt a week early. And it's why I never swim in the waters in Queensland, because those signs about the jellyfish. I mean, do the jellyfish know that it's October to May? I mean, so nature doesn't follow these timetables all that reliably. So, and if there's no sign saying crocodiles, I'm definitely still not swimming. So, As we know, the boys went into the cave, as they'd done many times before, and on their way back out of the cave, they found suddenly the tunnel was flooded in front of them and they were trapped. So just to put you on the map, we're right in the very most northern part of Thailand, a little village called Mae Sai, which sits right on the border into Myanmar, formerly Burma. And a lot of these boys were from Myanmar. Their coach, the 25-year-old coach who went into the cave with them to help look after them, he was an orphan from Myanmar. There's a tribe up there called the Shan tribe. It's a bit of a minority and a bit persecuted, I think, in Myanmar. And a lot of them were from that tribe, and they would live back and forth across this fairly open border, and they would trade, their parents would trade in the markets in Mae Sai. But none of them had really access to a lot of the things that Thai citizens would take for granted, like healthcare and education. So in other words, these kids had had a bit of a tough life. I think they'd always had food on the table and, loving families, but life hadn't been that easy. And I think that little bit of hardship throughout these kids' life will be one of the major factors that would hold them in good stead as this event unfolds and they're put under enormous pressure to survive. Now, if you jump in a car, it's about a 10-minute drive down to the entrance of the Tamlawan cave, marked by that yellow pin there. And I'll show you a map shortly, but basically you go into the west, underneath that cloud, into the mountain. It's about 1.6 kilometres, and then you reach a T-junction. And at that T-junction, the cave forks to the right and to the left, parallel to the border of Myanmar on the left-hand side there. So here's that map of the cave, the bicycles, which the boys rode to the cave, marking the entrance. 1.6 kilometres into the west to that T-junction. And then you've got a choice of two paths. You can either turn right and go north into that very skinny little tunnel called the Monk Series. What's interesting about that is that firstly, when you stand at the T-junction and you look to the north, it's like a hole in the wall about a 1 metre diameter. And that's where all the water from the catchment area in the mountains floods into the cave. And so within 24 hours, that is going to be like a huge jet or siphon of water pouring into this T-junction area and flooding the cave. If you turn left and head south, the tunnel's quite easy to walk through. And in fact, there's 10 kilometres of passageway in this cave, and it goes way off the bottom of this slide. And the kids were going 5 Ks into this cave. I mean, they were very capable little cavers. And they each had a headlight on, so they walked into this cave, probably twice the distance off the bottom of the screen, to a little spot that they had as their club rooms, I guess. It was their secret place, and apparently it's got beautiful crystals inside it. They wrote their names in the mud as they did, and turned around to come back out. And they just got to the T-junction and realised, hang on, the tunnel's changed. There's water up to the ceiling, and they were trapped. So they stayed there for that first 24 hours, but the next day they realised the water was actually coming up and lapping at their feet. So they had to retreat further south back into the cave, down towards that red circle. And over the next 3 days, they basically spent that time walking up and down that tunnel between the T-junction and the red circle, hoping to find another exit, surviving by drinking the water that was starting to come up through the floor as the groundwater, as the water table slowly rose, and becoming more and more concerned that the cave, instead of receding, was actually getting more and more flooded. And in fact, over the next 3 days, that's exactly what happened, because on day 3, they were down around that area of the red circle, and suddenly I'm told they felt a bit of a breeze coming down the tunnel, and then could hear a noise, and then suddenly saw this wall of water come around the corner and literally chase them down the tunnel. Now, they were very lucky at that moment that they were standing in the one place in the cave where there is some high ground. And if you stand in that red circle and you look up to the west, there's a very steep slope of mud, probably steeper than these stairs. And at the top of that, about 10, 12 metres high, there's an area about 3 or 4 metres across with a flat, muddy platform. And they all sprinted up the hill as the water rushed past, and they sat down there to wait and see what would happen. Now, to paint a mental picture of what that must have been like for them, they've now been in there for 3 days. They've had no food at all in that time. They took no food into the cave with them. They were, as I say, just drinking the water from this river as it flowed past. They had headlights, but the coach, being a smart guy, was making them conserve their light. So a lot of the time they're sitting in the dark, just listening to the water flowing and dripping. And cold, like really cold. These are very skinny little kids. The smallest one was under 30 kilos, and they're wet. They're just wearing t-shirt and shorts. And not only that, but imagine, their morale after 3 days. And furthermore, they realised, I'm sure, that they hadn't told anyone where they were going. So you can imagine in their minds, they would think, not only are we now trapped a distance which was 2.4 kilometres from the entrance, but no one even knows where we are, let alone how they would come and rescue them. So they would have been 100% sure they were going to die in that cave at that time. And it's to me, these kids are the incredible heroes of this story, where they found that courage and resilience to actually just survive and hang on. Because we know from experience, from the classic lifeboat story, you cast adrift from your boat, you're in the little lifeboat and there's 10 people. They tell me that you can pick who will survive and who will die, very early on. The people who start to take inventory and make a plan to catch fish or catch rainwater, ration out the food, all those sorts of things, they're the survivors. The people who go, we're screwed, and curl up in the corner, they will actually often die first before the other people. So, you can die before you run out of the essentials in life. So these kids are very tough. Now, one of the police who arrived on the scene realised that they needed an expert who knew the cave very well. So they called a guy called Vern Unsworth, who's an Englishman who lives in that part of Thailand because of the caving. And he became famous, unfortunately, because of his dealings with Elon Musk later on in the story, but I'm not going to dwell on that. And anyway, Vern arrived at the cave at 2 a.m. on that first Sunday morning, and he went in to the cave as far as the T-junction, and he witnessed this water flooding in through that from that monks series. And he realised that if the kids had survived this initial flooding event and they were on the other side of this sump, newly formed sump, then they were going to need some cave divers to safely explore it. And being an Englishman, he called the British Embassy and recommended that they got some cave divers out from the UK. What's interesting is on that first night when a lot of emergency services and so forth went into the cave, they were standing on one side of the T-junction. The boys were literally about 8 metres away on the other side of that very short sump. And the boys, sitting in the quiet, could hear the workers, could hear them shouting and working and yelling. But those guys, because of the sound of the water, couldn't hear the kids screaming back. And if they just had one diver who'd successfully gone through there with a rope, they probably would have all come out that very first night. But that was not to be. So anyway, these British divers appeared, and many of you will know these faces from the various films and books, and probably if you've got the T-shirt. They arrived on the following Wednesday. And on the left is a guy called Rick Stanton, who used to be a fireman in Coventry, and his longtime dive buddy John Valanthan, who's got an IT business down in Bristol. And I'll just tell you what they do for a living, because just a reminder, these are just normal blokes like myself who just have this slightly unusual hobby in cave exploration. We're never quite sure why it hasn't caught on, why it's not more popular, but even after the publicity of this event, we haven't really been flooded with applicants for the Cave Diving Association, but fair enough. That's fine, all the more caves for me. But Rick and John, even in this small sort of global pool of cave explorers, are like the rock stars of our sport. They're the Donald Bradmans or the Yvonne Goolagong's, I don't know. They're the best, right? So, and when I heard that they were coming to Thailand, I was immediately, optimistic that if anyone could find these kids, if they were still alive, it would be these two guys. Now, I knew Rick quite well already. I'd been on a couple of expeditions with him, and I certainly knew of John. And as I say, they're very famous in our little circle of nerds. So, anyway, they arrived on the Wednesday. They went straight down to the cave, and the first obstacle that they met actually wasn't anything environmental. It was the captain of the Thai Navy SEAL Regiment. Now, the Navy SEALs, obviously, the best divers in the world, the fittest, most dangerous, most capable people in any military unit. They had arrived at the cave early on, and they were trying to dive through the floodwaters that had appeared out of the entrance to the cave, and they were not being successful. So when these two sort of middle-aged blokes, pale and pasty from the UK, arrived with their somewhat homemade ensemble of diving equipment, which cave divers are a bit famous for, and in fact we do make a lot of it ourselves, you can imagine the spit and polish of the Thai Navy SEAL Regiment standing there looking at these two old boys with the holes in the knees of their wetsuits and saying, what do you think you're doing? You're not going in that cave, you won't survive a minute. And John and Rick, very good cave divers, maybe not great diplomats, I'm not sure, but a bit of an argument ensued. In the end, the captain said, fine, you guys do what you need to do, but we're not coming in to pull your bodies out when you inevitably die. So John and Rick went into the cave and then struck the second obstacle, which in fact was the force of this water that was flowing out. And they could make no headway at all. They just got spat straight out. So with their tail between their legs, I imagine they came back very shortly after. But they weren't put off. They came back the following day and tried a second time, same result. But then on the third day, the Friday, so nearly a week after the kids entered the cave, something had changed, and probably a couple of things. The rains had eased off, and also some of the water pumping operations that were trying to lower the level of the cave had made some gains. And so they started to advance into the cave. And just, again, another mental picture for you. Remember that about a year's worth of mud and muck was being washed out of this cave at that time. So the visibility of the water was essentially zero. It's like swimming through chocolate milk. And when I'm diving in water that has no visibility, I usually just close my eyes. I find it less confronting than, staring at the blackness. So they would have been probably eyes closed, just pulling themselves hand over hand into this very strong flow, just trying to aim into the strongest flow to keep moving through the cave, and all the time dragging a big bag of climbing rope with them, and they would tie that off to a stalactite or a projection every 20 or 30 metres so that they always had a path back out of the cave, which if you are starting to think about cave diving now, that's rule number one of cave diving, is always have a piece of string to follow home so you don't get lost, which has inevitable consequences. And literally metre after metre, with the help of the Thai Navy SEALs, to give them credit, and some other European divers, but the lion's share done by these guys, 2.4 kilometres later, they, on day 9, surfaced in what became known as Chamber 9 to see the ghostly images of those very, very thin boys by this stage coming down that muddy slope. And I suspect many of you will remember that extraordinary bit of GoPro footage from John Valanthan as he calls out to these kids, "How many of you are there?" And one of the little boys, Abdul, who speaks a little bit of English, says 13, and John goes, "Brilliant." And that was the moment that the world kind of rejoiced. And I remember seeing footage of the parents outside the cave crying with happiness, everyone clapping and dancing around. But for John and Rick and those of us in the know, it was like, okay, but what now? These kids, 2.5 kilometres, what was a 3-hour dive out of the cave through very, very difficult and treacherous conditions, no visibility, just following a rope with your eyes closed for all that time. You can't bring children out in the same way. So what's going to happen? How are we going to get them out? And they were very pessimistic immediately about the potential outcomes. Now, I'd been following the rescue for all of this time. In fact, I had been actively trying to get myself involved, ringing people who I knew in Thailand who I'd done caving with over there before. I just had this really strong sense that I could do something, and I didn't know what it was at this stage, but I needed to be there. And because I knew Rick, I'd also been chatting to him, and about 3 days after the children were found, and the British guys had been taking food into the kids to help feed them up and keep them alive. Some Navy SEALs had gone in to join the kids. There were supposed to be 2 who would stay in the cave with the boys, a medic and a doctor. But in the end, 7 of them went in and had pretty much run out of air, and they only had enough air for 3 of them to come back out. So there were now 4 adults trapped in the cave with these 13 young people. And so I was exchanging messages with Rick on this day. On this morning, I was in the operating theatre, one eye on the patient, obviously, and a couple of little texts, a nice sort of scan multitask. And Rick was saying there's some stuff to talk about, and we got on the phone after this, and he expanded on what he meant. And what he was saying was there were 2 big worries for him. Firstly, he still didn't believe there was any possible way these children were going to leave the cave alive. And he and John wanted to leave Thailand because he didn't believe there was any role for them apart to wait to do the body recoveries later on, and he didn't really want to have a part of that. The second thing he was very worried about was all these other divers flooding into the cave following the rope that had been laid, because sadly history is littered with the bodies of very, very experienced and highly trained divers, whether they're military or police or commercial divers, who are not specifically trained in cave diving, because it is a very different type of experience, training required, equipment and experience needed, especially for a cave like this. So they were worried, and sadly that prophecy was fulfilled about 14 hours after this conversation when Saman Gunan, the former Thai Navy SEAL, drowned while he was taking some wetsuits into the cave. And then at the end of this, he just sort of tacks on this sentence, and maybe he thought I wouldn't notice it if he just typed it quickly, but it said, "Could you sedate someone to dive them out of the cave?" And I just sort of did a double take when I saw this, because I don't think you need to be an anaesthetist or a cave diver to realise that if you render someone unconscious and then push their head underwater for what will be a 3-hour journey through a very difficult cave like this, they're not going to be alive at the other end of it. And this didn't come just from theoretical concerns, although I could immediately think of at least 20 ways these kids would die, but also through this training I'd been doing. I had at one stage wondered myself if what would happen if someone had a diabetic coma or a stroke or a head injury and their conscious state was impaired. Could we dive them out? And so we'd practice using those full face masks, because obviously you can't hold anything in your mouth if you've got altered consciousness. So we'd practice using full face masks, and I'd got someone to sort of push me around underwater through a cave wearing one of these things while I pretended to be unconscious. And I found that very slowly but surely the mask would fill up with water unless I took active steps to clear it. So I was 100% sure that over the course of 3 hours through a very difficult cave, these kids would drown in the mask, if not the other 19 ways I thought they could die. So my response was pretty emphatic. I said, absolutely not. But we jumped on the phone and I said, look, I'll come to Thailand, but I'm not doing that. Maybe I can go to the far end of the cave and administer medical care to the kids while you guys come up with a better plan than that one. And so that's basically the start of Craig and I being on the plane. Always take a friend with you when you're going on an adventure, and Craig's always up for it, so he was happy to come. So we headed off to Thailand that evening and arrived in Chiang Rai the next day. Now, the first thing I wanted to do, well, I got out of this high-ace van when I arrived to be greeted by, firstly, a sea of media, secondly, a sea of mud and rain everywhere, and literally thousands of people, upwards of 10,000 people apparently in or around this mountain by the end of the rescue. And so it was chaos, and to a newcomer it was terrifying. It was just like, where do I go to find out what's going on? So I asked to be taken to see the cave divers. Find your own tribe, as you often do when you first get to a conference. I find, just find the guys from the office who I know, and then I'll be braver and go and talk to other people. So I went and found the British cave diving camp, and 2 more guys had arrived, and they were helping take food in during that day. And I remember thinking, well, first of all, I've got to look after myself. My own safety is always a priority. And I said to Rick, what's the cave like? Will I be all right to dive it? Because just because the god of cave diving, Rick Stanton, can dive, it doesn't mean that mere mortals can. And I remember Rick saying something which absolutely frightened the life out of me. He said, "Oh, Harry, the cave, it's a bit sporting, but I think you'll be all right." So I said, right, okay, well, first priority for me and Craig is to actually dive the cave tomorrow, just to make sure that we don't, kill ourselves and become a burden to the rest of the rescue. And I also just wanted to see these kids for myself. I'd spent nearly 2 weeks thinking about them by this stage and wondering what was going on, and I just needed to see them for myself to get this thing more than sort of a hypothetical in my mind. So fortunately at this stage the whole operation didn't hang on the cave diving solution, and there was a lot of stuff in place, and I haven't got time to talk about the myriad kind of options that were being discussed, but the most obvious one was empty the water out of the cave, and even that plan, there were a dozen different ways they were approaching it. But one example is these big drill rigs down near the entrance to the cave, drilling down into the groundwater and pumping all the groundwater out into this man-made canal, which was going out to flood the local rice paddies. Now, I learnt later on that many hundreds of local rice farmers voluntarily sacrificed their crops for this mission, all in the name of helping save these young boys. And when I heard that, I found that a very profound thing. You can imagine these pretty impoverished local farmers in this remote area, giving up a whole rice crop to help save these boys. That is a massive sacrifice, and it made me realise that this sort of global collaboration, all with this common goal, was something that I was incredibly lucky and felt very privileged to be a part of. And I think there's a message there for the whole global community, that we can work together to solve things when we all understand, the shared priority and the goal. So anyway, Craig and I dived the cave, and as Rick said, look, it was a bit sporting, but you also have to remember this is what we do on the weekends for fun. So I know a lot of people have said, oh, that was very brave or heroic to dive through these caves, but actually this is what we do quite like doing. So I never felt that my life was in any particular danger in this cave, although you wouldn't normally dive in an actively flooding cave like this for fun, but you know, it was within our capabilities. For me, it was always the fear of what to do about these children. That was this huge moral dilemma for me. Now, whilst Craig and I dived, the Brits and some guys from the American Air Force pararescue team, they're like sort of a combination of paramedics and special forces operators. They got 3 kids from the local swimming club. I'm assured they were volunteers, and they went down to the swimming pool and they started to dress them up in the way that Rick was envisaging they could be brought out of the cave. So obviously that full face mask again becoming a very vital piece of the equipment, they started to put together a plan that would look a bit like this. So myself and those 4 British guys would go all the way to the far end of the cave. We only had one mask that would actually seal on the kids' faces. Remember how tiny they were, and those masks are made for commercial divers who are normally more my size. So there was only one brand of mask that they could find that would fit the kids, and we only had 4 of those masks. So that became a rate limiting step, that we could only get 4 out per day. And so 4 kids would be fasted for their anaesthetic, and one by one they'd dress in their wetsuits, they would come down that very steep hill, they would sit on my lap in the water, I'd give them an injection of the ketamine as an intramuscular injection through their wetsuit into their thigh. They take about 3 to 5 minutes with that loading dose to go to sleep, and then we'd finish dressing them in a full face mask and strap a cylinder of 80% oxygen to their chest. The water's pretty shallow, so you could use high oxygen levels, and partly for the anaesthetic implications, but also in my mind, you know, inevitably when they drowned, at least they'll be full of oxygen and there might be a chance of resuscitating them when they got through the sump to the next air chamber, which was sort of intermittent along the way. There were about 6 different sumps to dive through with air chambers in between on the way out. So that was the plan, and you know, by this stage I had been on the ground for about 24 to 36 hours. I'd had a chance to look at all the other plans that were in place. You know, could we teach the kids to dive? Decided that was impossible in the time available. Could we, you know, drill holes down to them? Could we put in a submarine? Could we do all this other stuff? And one by one, I realised that not one of those things had any chance or possibility of working or success. The meteorologists told us in these meetings that night that we had 3 to 5 days before the monsoons returned, and when they returned they predicted they would stay this time, and that would be the end of all the diving operations because all the pumps would be immediately overwhelmed again and the river would become undivable. The other thing we knew was the oxygen levels in that chamber where the boys were starting to deteriorate. They'd been measured that day as being down to about 15.2%. And the third thing was that the environment itself, now the kids had food and these Navy SEALs were in there with them, you can imagine for obvious reasons the environment's deteriorating, the drinking water's not sustainable, and the kids were starting to get chest infections. So I knew that if we didn't do something, then those kids were going to die, and they were going to die a very slow and protracted death from infection, starvation, or exposure. And their bodies wouldn't be coming out for 3 to 6 months, according to the meteorologists. So that was plan A, get on a plane and fly back to Adelaide to leave them to die, and I knew I couldn't do that. Plan B was I finally had to face up to the idea of this anaesthetic plan. And in my mind, I still felt that these children had 100%, you know, mortality rate if we went down this path. But sometimes I think the idea of doing something is easier than the idea of doing nothing, and any plan is better than no plan at all. And I think I got myself over the line by telling myself, well, the kids are going to die anyway, so isn't it better that they die in their sleep under the anaesthetic, and at least they will be returned to their parents you know, within the next couple of days. Now, that's pretty poor justification for a plan, and but to me, it just seemed crystal clear that we had to do something, and this was the only thing that was available. So This is the sort of moment when I had to make my decision, I guess, and I said to the Thai leadership, who I give great credit for having the courage to give this the green light. You know, it would have been very easy for them just to let things sort of wander along for another couple of days and then the decision be taken out of their hands. And it's not exactly a no-fault system over there with the, you know, the military junta that runs the government. You don't want to be seen to be making bad decisions. So it was very courageous of them to give us the green light. And to be fair, I didn't tell them my views about the 100% theory. I did say something like, look, it's very high risk, but we're prepared to try it if you want. To be honest, I didn't think they would say yes if I said they're all going to die. I mean, I don't think anyone would be able to give permission for that. So I was a bit cheeky with the measure of truth. Anyway, so we were dismissed off to bed, and they said they'll tell us the answer in the morning. Set me up for a really great night's sleep. And before I left, I got the Thai Army Medical Corps to prepare the ketamine. There was no pharmacist there. Where were you? And they basically prepared all the ketamine for the next day. Now, it's about this moment where I started to think a bit more about my ketamine practice in the past, which had been pretty extensive. But to be honest, I'd only ever given ketamine intramuscularly on one occasion, and that was in an emergency department with some giant of a man on meth throwing chairs around the room, and I sort of snuck in, darted him, and then ran out again. You can start to wonder about the way I practice medicine, can't you? And I'd never thought about maintaining an anaesthetic, an ongoing anaesthetic with intramuscular ketamine. And a quick review of the literature didn't really help me in any way. There was no recipe available. So what is the dose? What is the maintenance dose? And how often is it? And what happens when you're a skinny, cold, malnourished kid? And there was a lot of stuff to think about. I'm, thinking back to my pharmacokinetics and came up lacking, wishing I'd paid more attention in those lectures. So. The other problem I realised was that I wasn't going to be able to take each of those kids all the way out of the cave. I sort of felt that that was my role, to look after these unconscious boys. But if I did that, only 1 or 2 kids would come out per day, and we might only have 3 days. So in other words, I had to teach the other divers to be anaesthetists, to do the top-ups, because otherwise we wouldn't get our 4 out per day plus an extra one on the last day. So this is me giving my now famous Anaesthesia 101 lecture to what I would say that were the most attentive students I've ever had in my life. And I think you can see Rick Stanton's face there in the black T-shirt as it's starting to dawn on him the evil genius of his plan, and not really realising that he was being promoted to head anaesthetist. It is a testament to the courage and pragmatism of these guys, what an extraordinary job they did, and not only face the terror of looking after these unconscious people, but actually doing a really, really good job. I also devised what I think is, in a moment of brilliance, a recipe to help these guys by, obviously I didn't want them drawing up ketamine in the cave as they were floating down the river. There's a bit of a chance for a drug error there, I imagine. So I decided to divide the children into small kids and big kids, and then label all the syringes as small and large. So I would anaesthetise a boy, hand it over to the British diver and say, this is a small one, okay? So all they had to do when they got to one of the air chambers and the kid was starting to rouse was find the syringe that said small and jab it in the leg. I told them, don't worry, you can't do any harm, it's very safe, just stick it in their thigh. This is much like your vaccination lectures, I imagine. Stick it in the anterior lateral thigh. If you hit the bone, don't worry about it, just come back a little bit. The only thing you can do wrong is if you inject it in the wetsuit, it probably won't work. And so anyway, I was sent this photo by one of the Navy SEALs when they were clearing out the cave the following year, so it sort of gave me a bit of a laugh to see my handwriting on one of these muddy syringes. So fast forward to the end of the cave, and that's me in the white helmet. I'm injecting one of these boys who's sitting on my lap. You can see the quality of the water has deteriorated a fair bit, and the smell, I have to say, was beyond description. And, these are painful injections. I mean, the needle would be somewhat blunted, I imagined, as it went through the wetsuit into their thigh, big volume of drug. And these kids, they did not squeak, they did not complain. A couple of them screwed their eyes up. But then all of them, after I gave them an injection, gave me that beautiful Thai way that they do, and just, break your heart when you see someone saying thank you for what I've felt like was almost certainly going to be euthanasia for these children. It was very tough, I have to say, especially that first day with those first couple of kids doing this. I thought, seriously, what am I doing? What right have I got to be potentially, well, euthanizing these children. It was a very difficult day, especially, once the kids were asleep, we got them dressed in the rest of their gear, and I remember very clearly pushing, the first child's face into that water, and then quickly lifting them up, having a look inside their mask to see if there was any water inside it, and when it looked all right, put them back for about 30 seconds, and then lift them up again, and then for the third and final time, just leave them lying face down in the water, watching the bubbling from the face mask, and and then moving on to the next thing, which was even harder because we'd decided that we were going to restrain the kids. We'd put cable ties around their wrists. We told the kids it was to keep the water out of the wetsuits, which were a bit ill-fitting. But in fact, we were going to put carabiners through the cable ties behind with the hands behind their backs. And, I'd never had done that to a human being before, nor would I ever expect to do it again. But that act is a very symbolic thing, to restrain someone like that was a really horrible thing to do. But we did it because we wanted the kids to be nice and streamlined like this, so the British guy could sort of push them through some of the very tight parts of the cave. And also, in case the kids woke up unexpectedly underwater, of course, their first response would be immediate panic. And panicking divers do one of two things. They either rip their own mask off or they take the mask or regulator from the diver who's with them. And I couldn't afford for any of these kids, for any of my British friends to be, killed in this exercise. So that's what we decided to do. And no one was more surprised than me when, after I came out of the cave at the end of the first day and was told that 4 out of 4 of the children had survived that first day, which kind of for me set the scene of my most anxious time, I think, in the whole period, when I realised that this had succeeded, and then we had to do it again the next day and the day after that. And after that first day, that was the most frightened I think I ever was, when I suddenly thought, I don't know how this has worked, but tomorrow, I'll be exposed as the fraud that I know I am. And furthermore, people are going to be asking, you guys have done something wrong because they survived yesterday. So that was pretty harrowing. And then the third day, 4 kids plus the coach, and we got the last kid out, who turned out to be the smallest one, unfortunately, which was a bit unexpected. He was 29 kilos, a boy called Mark, and we'd taken in these extra masks to try for what we thought would be the coach. We assumed the coach would come out last. And when this tiny little boy came down the hill, and I realised it wasn't going to be the coach, who had already gone, because he wasn't even as big. The coach wasn't as big as the biggest kid, so I kind of missed that. Obviously didn't take a very good history. And this tiny little boy comes down, and me and Jason, the last British diver, are looking at this boy, looking at the 2 masks we've got. One of them is literally 1.5 times the width of his face, and the second one is this sort of toy thing with a pink silicone seal that kept collapsing and wouldn't seal properly. And in the end, I just said to Jason, I'm sorry, you've just got to go, because he's just getting colder and colder, so you're just going to have to risk it. And Jason took that boy out, holding his face, tucked under Jason's chin for the entire swim out, holding the rope to find his way out. It was an extraordinary bit of diving, and Jason literally saved that boy's life. So just in finishing, on a happier note, we can all breathe again, it worked, as you know. And the next day, Craig and I bluffed our way into the Chiang Rai hospital on the pretense of doing a ward round to see our patients. At that stage, no one was allowed into this ward, which had been isolated, not even the parents, because they were concerned about some weird cave infections. So I'm not sure why they let us in, but in we went. And I just want to talk about this boy as I finish, because his name is Titan, which for a 30-kilo lad is probably a nickname he needs to grow into a little bit. You can see the size of his hand in mine. I mean, they're tiny little boys. But the thing about Titan is he kind of became a mascot for the whole team, because he's the cheekiest little bugger I've ever met. And that smile did not leave his face the whole time we dealt with him in or out of the cave. And it just made me think once again, and it's kind of become an obsession over the last 5.5 years, is what was it about these boys that made them so courageous and so resilient? And I wondered, was it their Thai culture or their Buddhist faith, or was it just the fact that they're tough country kids who have had a little bit of a hard life up until that point? And I put great stead in the fact that doing things that are hard or uncomfortable is actually very, very beneficial to all of us. And that's become my mantra, I think, in life, and talking to young people especially, but also to parents, who have younger kids, to make sure you let children have some freedom to find their own boundaries, to become risk managers in life. Because if they stay on their screens inside the whole time and you don't let them ride off on their bikes to the park by themselves with their mates or off to school, then they're not going to learn to manage their own boundaries. And when they face that first hurdle in life, that's when they're going to collapse. And you need to train them up to be ready for this life ahead. And the other thing I realised in this sort of question of the cave was that the one thing maybe that I was proud of was that I found the courage to make a decision. And looking and thinking back over my career, the decision makers that I've really respected, and I don't know if Napoleon had the internet, by the way, so I don't really know if he wrote this, but the decision makers I've respected in life are those people who can make a decision when all the options are appallingly bad. And all I know is, and I think one of the panel said that this morning, that doing nothing, paralysis is death, and literally in this case, but for your organisation or in any aspect of your life, you need to make a decision and move forward. You need to be ready to correct your course and take advice from people around you, of course, but if you do nothing, then you'll go nowhere. Now, I'd like to say we've got time for questions, but unfortunately we've got 32 seconds and it'll take me that time to walk off the stage. So thank you for listening. Have a great conference.
Thank you much, Richard. Just stay there for a second. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Some people do extraordinary things in their lives, and then there's some people who put children to sleep and take them through a water tunnel, which is just beyond.
It was my pharmacy joke. That's what got
me. Oh, sorry, it was the pharmacy joke that got you the
so.
Yeah, fair enough.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I know Richard's getting picked up at 11 o'clock. If you want to crash tackle him outside while you grab a coffee, please, I'll just say this on your behalf. Please do that and say good day to Richard. We're getting going here to keep us on time back here at 11 a.m. We've got a great lineup of guest speakers for you today, so please come back here at 11 a.m. Grab a coffee. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you. Cheers, mate. Thanks.